The megachurch rises from the Texas plains like a monument to certainty itself. 30,000 seats, $50 million construction cost, attendance down 47% since 2019. On a Sunday morning in October 2023, a 22-year-old worship leader named Megan posts a video that will get 11 million views in 3 days. She's crying, but she's also relieved. "I can't do this anymore," she says into her phone camera. "I can't pretend that what I was taught makes sense." By Monday, she's lost her job. By Tuesday, she's gained 70,000 followers. By Wednesday, her grandmother stopped speaking to her. This is happening everywhere across the Bible Belt, and it's not isolated incidents anymore. It's a wave. The exodus is real, it's accelerating, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. Between 2009 and 2024, the portion of Gen Z in the South identifying as religiously unaffiliated jumped from 11% to 38%. That's not a gradual cultural shift. That's a collapse. In states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, where 90% of adults identified as Christian just 2 decades ago, youth pastors are scrambling to understand why their Sunday school rooms are emptying faster than they can redecorate them with trendy LED lights and coffee bars. But here's what makes this moment in history so different from previous generational rebellions. These young people aren't just leaving quietly, they're documenting everything. They're organizing. They're creating counter-narratives with production value that would make their church's media team jealous. And most devastating of all for the institutions they're leaving behind, they're using the very same rhetorical tools they learned in Bible study to dismantle the structures that raised them. The Bible Belt, for those unfamiliar, isn't just a cute nickname for the American South. It's a region spanning from Texas to Virginia where evangelical Protestant Christianity has dominated culture, politics, and social life for over a century. We're talking about an area where, until very recently, asking someone which church they attended wasn't small talk. It was essential information. Where high school football games opened with prayer. Where Sunday morning was so sacred that some counties still had blue laws prohibiting alcohol sales. Where the church you belonged to determined your social network, your business connections, sometimes even your marriage prospects. The term Bible Belt itself was coined in 1924 by journalist H. L. Mencken, and it was not meant as a compliment. But the region embraced it anyway, wearing it as a badge of honor. For generations, this worked. The social pressure, the community cohesion, the moral framework, it all functioned to maintain religious participation across generations, until it didn't. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we examine the forces that shape our world. If you find value in what we do here, a super thanks goes a long way in helping us create more content like this. Jackson grew up in a small town outside Birmingham, Alabama. Population 4,000. 7 churches. His parents were good people, he'll tell you that immediately because he knows what you're thinking. This isn't a story about abuse or hypocrisy, at least not in his case. His youth pastor was genuinely kind. His church ran a food bank. They sent mission teams to build houses in Honduras. By all conventional measures, this was Christianity functioning as intended. But Jackson had questions. Not rebellious questions at first, just curious ones. Why did God create people he knew would go to hell? If the Bible is inerrant, why do different translations say different things? Why is homosexuality considered worse than divorce when Jesus talked about divorce explicitly, and homosexuality never? His youth pastor gave him the standard answers. Faith. Mystery. God's ways are higher than our ways. Trust the authorities God has placed over you. Then Jackson got to college. Not a liberal bastion on the coast, but Auburn University, right there in Alabama. And he started meeting people who'd been taught completely different versions of Christianity in churches 50 miles away. One believed in predestination, another in free will. One thought dancing was sinful, another had a full worship band. One believed in young earth creationism, another accepted evolution. All of them claimed absolute certainty that they had it right. That's when it clicked for me, Jackson says in his testimony video. It wasn't that I found better arguments against Christianity, it's that I realized the arguments for it were completely arbitrary depending on who was teaching you. This is the pattern that shows up again and again in exit stories from Gen Z. It's not primarily about science versus religion, though that plays a role. It's about the recognition that the certainty they were sold was artificial, that the authority figures who demanded their complete trust had no more access to ultimate truth than anyone else, that the entire system relied on not asking the next obvious question. What makes this particularly devastating for Bible Belt Christianity is that certainty has been its selling point. These aren't traditions that marketed themselves on mystery or paradox or contemplative spirituality. They marketed themselves on having all the answers. Clear, simple, absolute. The Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it. Bumper sticker theology. But Gen Z has something previous generations didn't have at their fingertips. They have immediate access to every biblical scholar, every historical critique, every comparative religion course, every former pastor's deconstruction story, all available on their phones while they're sitting in the church pew. A youth pastor in Georgia tells me he can see it happening in real time. He'll make a claim in youth group, something straightforward like, archaeological evidence proves the Bible is historically accurate, and he'll watch kids pulling out their phones. Not to text, to fact-check him, right there. And they're finding that his claim is, at best, an oversimplification, and at worst, contradicted by the majority of archaeologists, including Christian ones. I didn't lie to them, he insists. I just repeated what I'd been taught. But they don't care about my intentions. They care that I was wrong and presented it as certain. The statistics paint a stark picture. According to Pew Research data from 2024, 62% of Gen Z adults who were raised in evangelical households in the South are no longer regularly attending church. Of those, 41% identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. These aren't just college kids going through a phase. Follow-up studies show that unlike previous generations, who often returned to church in their 30s when they had children, Gen Z ex-evangelicals are not coming back. At 35, their religious affiliation rates are basically identical to what they were at 25. But let's talk about what triggered the acceleration. Because while the foundation was cracking for years, there were specific events that turned a leak into a flood. November 2016. 81% of white evangelical voters in the Bible Belt voted for Donald Trump. For many Gen Z evangelicals, this was the moment the mask came off. Not because Trump was conservative, they'd grown up with conservative politics intertwined with their faith, but because the very same purity culture that had policed their bodies, their thoughts, their music choices, their relationship boundaries, the very same moral framework that had told them character matters, that integrity is paramount, that sexual sin disqualifies you from leadership, all of it evaporated overnight. 20-year-old Sarah from Tennessee describes watching her church leaders, the same ones who'd subjected her to true love waits purity pledges and modesty lectures, enthusiastically defend a thrice-married man caught on tape bragging about sexual assault. They didn't even seem embarrassed, she says. That's what got me. Not that they made a political calculation, but that they were so shameless about abandoning everything they'd told us was non-negotiable. The Trump era was a stress test for evangelical moral authority, and in the Bible Belt, it failed spectacularly. Gen Z watched and took notes. If all those absolute moral standards could be suspended for political convenience, were they ever really absolute? If character suddenly didn't matter for a president, did it ever really matter, or was it just a tool of control? Then came the pandemic. Zoom Church revealed something uncomfortable. Without the social pressure, without the community surveillance, without the emotional manipulation of live worship music and charismatic preaching, a lot of Bible Belt Christianity just didn't work. Watching a sermon in your pajamas while scrolling Twitter made the manipulation tactics visible in a way they'd never been before. The emotional build, the manufactured crisis, the altar call designed to produce a response whether or not the argument was coherent. Megachurches that depended on spectacle couldn't recreate it through a screen. Small churches that depended on social obligation couldn't enforce it remotely. And thousands of young people, given permission to step back for just a moment, decided not to step back in. I want to pause here and ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what's your story? Are you someone who left? Someone who stayed? Someone watching from outside this culture entirely? Drop a comment. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective and what time it is where you are. The response from Bible Belt religious institutions has been, in many cases, precisely calibrated to make the problem worse. Rather than addressing the substantive critiques, many have doubled down on the persecution narrative. They've characterized the Exodus as evidence of spiritual warfare, of satanic deception, of the prophesied end times falling away. This might be comforting to the remaining faithful, but it does nothing to address the concerns of those leaving. Some churches have tried to modernize, hipper worship music, better coffee, pastors in skinny jeans instead of suits. They've installed Instagram-worthy neon signs with scripture verses. They've created young adult ministries with ping pong tables and craft beer where allowed. They've rebranded fundamentalism as radical faith and repackaged purity culture as authentic relationships. But Gen Z sees through aesthetic updates. They're not leaving because the music is outdated. They're leaving because they've been taught that the Bible is inerrant and then discovered biblical scholarship showing it's a collection of texts written by different authors over centuries with contradictions, edits, and political agendas. They're leaving because they were taught that Christianity is about love and then watched their churches campaign against gay marriage, trans rights, and abortion access. They're leaving because they were taught that truth matters and then watched their communities spread conspiracy theories about vaccines, elections, and Democratic politicians drinking children's blood. This is the brutality of Gen Z's verdict. It's not angry, though some of them are angry. It's not particularly emotional, though emotion is certainly present. It's something worse for the institutions on the receiving end. It's dismissive. They've simply stopped granting Bible Belt Christianity the presumption of good faith. They've looked at the fruits and judged the tree accordingly. The YouTube channel God is Gray, run by a progressive Christian named Brenda, has become a haven for deconstruction stories. She hosts young people from across the Bible Belt who share remarkably similar experiences. Purity culture that gave them sexual dysfunction. Worship of authority that left them vulnerable to abuse. Biblical literalism that made them anti-science. End times theology that gave them anxiety disorders. Hell-based evangelism that destroyed their relationships with non-Christian friends and family. One video features Emma from Oklahoma, who describes being homeschooled in a fundamentalist household. I was taught that dinosaurs weren't real, she explains, that fossils were either put there by God to test our faith or by Satan to deceive us. I believed this until I was 17 and saw an actual paleontology dig. Not on TV, in person. And I realized they lied to me. About something I could literally touch. What else did they lie about? This is the cascade effect. Once you recognize you've been systematically misled about one thing, everything becomes suspect. And Bible Belt Christianity, having staked so much on being the sole source of truth and authority, has no credibility reserves to draw on when the lies are exposed. The political radicalization of Bible Belt churches has accelerated the exodus. A Duke University study from 2023 found that 68% of Gen Z who left evangelical churches cited the church's political stances as a major factor. Not politics in general, but specific positions on LGBTQ rights, immigration, racial justice, and environmental issues. Take climate change. Gen Z is staring down an environmental crisis that will define their entire lives. They're watching unprecedented hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and temperature records. Scientific consensus is overwhelming, but many Bible Belt churches have made climate denial a theological position, either because addressing it would require inconvenient economic changes, or because they're so committed to end times theology that they think environmental destruction is supposed to happen, or because accepting climate science would mean accepting the authority of scientists over the authority of their interpretation of Genesis. 24-year-old Marcus from Louisiana puts it bluntly. My church told me climate change was a liberal hoax, while I was literally watching my grandfather's house flood for the third time in 5 years. They expected me to deny reality to maintain loyalty to their politics. I chose reality. The racial reckoning of 2020 was another inflection point. Gen Z is the most racially diverse generation in American history, even in the Bible Belt. They grew up with black friends, Latino classmates, Asian neighbors. Then George Floyd was murdered, and they watched protests sweep the nation. They waited for their churches to respond with moral clarity. And in many cases, what they got was defense of police, criticism of protesters, and sermons about respecting authority. Bible Belt Christianity has always had a complicated relationship with racism. These are churches built in the cradle of slavery, sustained through Jim Crow, often actively resistant to integration. Many have never fully reckoned with that history. Some still haven't integrated using coded language about traditional values and neighborhood churches to maintain de facto segregation. When Gen Z started asking why their churches were so white, why their curriculum ignored the black church tradition, why their pastors were silent on racial justice, the answers were unsatisfying. We don't see color. We're all one in Christ, they were told. But they could see color. They could see who had power, who made decisions, whose cultural expressions were deemed appropriate worship, and whose were deemed worldly. They could see the difference between their church's response to property damage during protests versus their response to police violence. And many of them concluded their churches were at best indifferent to racial justice, and at worst actively opposed to it, despite all the rhetoric about being pro-life and valuing all humans as image bearers of God. Then there's the LGBTQ issue, which has become the defining litmus test for many Gen Z evangelicals. Unlike older generations, Gen Z overwhelmingly supports LGBTQ rights. A 2024 poll found that 72% of Gen Z in the South support same-sex marriage. They have gay friends. They've watched those friends struggle with depression, suicide attempts, family rejection. They've seen the damage caused by conversion therapy and purity culture and hate the sin, love the sinner, rhetoric that feels loving to straight people but devastating to queer ones. The stories are heartbreaking. Tyler from Arkansas describes his best friend, Josh, who came out in high school. Tyler's church responded with an intervention, attempting to pray the gay away. When that didn't work, Josh was told he could remain in the church if he committed to lifelong celibacy and didn't promote a homosexual lifestyle. Josh left the church. 2 years later, he attempted suicide. He survived, but Tyler watched his friend nearly die because of theology he was supposed to defend. I had a choice, Tyler says. My church or my friend, my theology or his life. They kept telling me I could love him without affirming him, but he needed affirmation to survive. He needed to hear that he was okay as God made him. So I chose him. And once I made that choice, I couldn't stay in a church that saw it as the wrong one. This is playing out in thousands of Bible Belt families. Parents who thought they'd successfully transmitted their faith, discovering their kids not only disagree with them on LGBTQ issues, but consider their positions morally reprehensible. Not just wrong, but cruel. Not just theologically mistaken, but actively harmful. The churches have tried to thread the needle with compassionate anti-gay theology, but Gen Z isn't buying it. They recognize tone policing. They see that we love you, but God's design for sexuality is marriage between a man and a woman, produces the same family rejections, the same conversion therapy, the same elevated suicide rates among LGBTQ youth. The packaging doesn't change the outcome. What's particularly striking about the Gen Z exodus is the role of women. Bible Belt Christianity is deeply patriarchal. Complementarian theology teaches that men and women have different roles, with men as leaders and women as submissive helpers. Women can't be pastors in most evangelical churches. In many, they can't be deacons or elders. Some still teach that wives should submit to their husbands in all things. Gen Z women have grown up in a culture telling them they can be anything. They've seen women as CEOs, Supreme Court justices, astronauts, presidential candidates. They've been told in school that their ambition matters, their voices matter, their leadership matters. Then they go to church and are told their gender disqualifies them from certain roles because of how they were created. The cognitive dissonance is unsustainable. And when these young women start asking why, they get Genesis 2, they get 1 Timothy 2:12, they get God's design is complementary, not identical. What they don't get is a compelling reason why their gender should limit their calling if they genuinely believe God has gifted them for ministry. 26-year-old Rachel was a youth ministry leader at a large church in Nashville. She was good at it. The kids loved her. She felt called to it. Then her church hired a new youth pastor, a man, 23 years old, fresh out of Bible college, less experienced than Rachel. But he became her boss because he was male. When she raised concerns, she was told this was God's design, and her discomfort was prideful resistance to biblical authority. She quit, not just the position, the church. Eventually, Christianity altogether. If God's design includes making half of humanity subordinate based on genitalia, she says, then I want nothing to do with that God. This is the paradox Bible Belt Christianity created. They encouraged women to be educated, capable, and strong, but only up to a point. They developed women's leadership, but only in restricted domains. They taught women to think critically, then demanded they not apply that critical thinking to gender hierarchy. It was always going to collapse. The purity culture reckoning deserves its own examination. For decades, evangelical youth in the Bible Belt were subjected to intense sexual regulation, true love waits campaigns, purity rings, father-daughter purity balls where teenage girls pledged their virginity to their fathers until marriage, modesty doctrine that made girls responsible for boys' thought lives. Every Young Man's Battle and Every Young Woman's Battle, books that treated normal sexual development as spiritual warfare. The psychological damage is now being documented. Therapists report epidemic levels of sexual dysfunction among adults raised in purity culture. Inability to enjoy sex even within marriage because they've been taught for so long that sexual desire is dangerous and shameful. Guilt and anxiety about normal human sexuality. Confusion about consent because they've been taught that godly relationships have prescribed roles rather than mutual negotiation. Women in particular report being taught that their value decreased with sexual activity, that they were like a piece of tape that loses stickiness each time it's used, or a rose that loses petals when passed around, or chewed gum that no one wants. These metaphors intended to promote abstinence instead taught young women that sexual assault made them damaged goods, that a rape victim was less valuable, that their worth was tied to their sexual history in a way men's never was. And the boys weren't spared either. They were taught that normal sexual attraction was lust and therefore sin, that looking at a woman with desire was equivalent to adultery, that masturbation was sexual immorality. They were set up with impossible standards, told their struggles proved their sinfulness, and cycled through shame and recommitment and failure on an endless loop. Linda K. Klein's book, Pure Inside the Evangelical Movement, that shamed a generation of young women and How I Broke Free, became a bestseller largely on Gen Z purchases. It articulated what many of them had experienced, but hadn't had language for. The trauma wasn't incidental to purity culture, it was structural. The system worked through shame, and shame damages people. Now, in their 20s and 30s, Gen Z evangelicals are in therapy unpacking this damage. And many of them are concluding that a religious system that harmed them this badly about something as fundamental as sexuality has no credibility on anything else. The economic dimension is also significant, though less discussed. Gen Z is facing historic economic challenges: student debt, unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, gig economy precarity. They're on track to be the first generation in American history to be poorer than their parents. And Bible Belt Christianity, at least in its dominant forms, has aligned itself with prosperity gospel-adjacent theology and political positions that oppose economic reform. They're told to tithe 10% of their income to churches building multi-million-dollar facilities while they're drowning in debt. They're told God will provide while they're working 2 jobs and still can't afford health care. They're told the poor are poor because of character defects while they're watching billionaires pay lower tax rates than they do. The disconnect between what they're experiencing and what they're being taught is vast. Meanwhile, Bible Belt churches have largely opposed minimum wage increases, universal health care, student debt relief, and other policies that would materially improve Gen Z's lives. The political alignment with business interests over worker interests is obvious, and Gen Z sees it. They're not impressed by theological justifications for economic systems that are failing them. But perhaps nothing has been more damaging than the information ecosystem collapse. Gen Z watched their parents and grandparents, good Christian people they'd respected, fall into conspiracy theory rabbit holes. QAnon, anti-vaccine misinformation, election denial, COVID conspiracies, and they watch their churches either enable this or actively promote it. Pastors sharing anti-vaccine content, churches hosting speakers claiming the election was stolen, Bible studies discussing the deep state and Pizzagate. The mingling of extreme political conspiracy theories with religious authority was surreal and alienating. How could they trust spiritual guidance from people who believed Tom Hanks was trafficking children? The rise of Christian nationalism particularly disturbs Gen Z. They're watching movements that explicitly want to declare America a Christian nation, that want to impose biblical law on a pluralistic society, that see democracy as less important than godly leadership. This isn't theoretical. Seven Mountain Dominionism teaches that Christians should take control of seven spheres of society: government, education, media, arts and entertainment, religion, family, and business. It's mainstream in Bible Belt evangelical circles. Gen Z, even though still Christian, largely rejects this. They've grown up in a diverse world. They have Muslim friends, Hindu classmates, atheist colleagues. The idea that Christianity should dominate through political power rather than persuade through spiritual truth seems both un-American and un-Christ-like to them. The authoritarian impulses worry them. They see churches that demand unquestioning obedience to pastoral authority. They see movements that want to ban books, control curriculum, restrict reproductive rights, criminalize LGBTQ identity, and they recognize these impulses as fundamentally opposed to freedom. One of the most telling dynamics is how Gen Z uses the tools of their Bible Belt upbringing against the institutions themselves. They were taught to value truth, to be suspicious of worldly deception, to test everything against Scripture, so they did. They applied biblical criticism to the Bible itself. They studied the history of biblical canon formation and discovered it was a political process. They learned about the Council of Nicaea and realized core doctrines were decided by committee. They read about the thousands of biblical manuscript variations and understood that claims of inerrancy were untenable. They were taught apologetics, how to defend the faith intellectually. Then they encountered actual biblical scholarship, not pop apologetics from Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel, but academic work from Yale and Harvard and Notre Dame. And they discovered that the strongest arguments against their faith weren't from angry atheists, but from believing Christian scholars who'd spent their lives studying these texts and concluded that fundamentalist interpretations couldn't be sustained. This is the ultimate irony. Bible Belt Christianity armed its young people with critical thinking tools, then expected them never to turn those tools on the faith itself. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Now, there are entire online communities dedicated to deconstruction. Hashtags like deconstruction stories and exvangelical. Reddit forums with hundreds of thousands of members. TikTok accounts documenting the journey out. YouTube channels like Telltale, Holy Kool-Aid, and Pelagia that break down theological claims with devastating clarity. Gen Z isn't leaving in isolated shame. They're leaving in networked solidarity. And they're not silent. They're creating content, writing books, starting podcasts, testifying publicly. Unlike previous generations who might have quietly drifted away, Gen Z is documenting the process. They're explaining exactly why they left, what claims they found unpersuasive, what behaviors they found harmful. They're creating a public record that's far more damaging than simple absence because it inoculates the next generation.